Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Daniel Parker. I'm one of the founders of Diaspora Rhythms, and again, we welcome you. And to the men out there, happy Father's Day to all the fathers and figure and father figures. And more than that, let's have a joyous and happy Juneteenth. We are now officially a holiday. The education program of Diaspora Rhythms presents Glory in Fabrics, a quilter's perspective. This is the joint presentation by Diaspora Rhythms and Needles and Thread Quilters Guild. This afternoon, we will discuss and you will see how African Americans not only use the wonderful art form of quilting, and it is an art form, for comfort to keep their bodies warm, but also as a means of freedom and to tell their compelling stories. So, quilts had a major part of our culture and our history. And to begin this exciting afternoon is a member of our own education program, Jean Chaney. Jean says that she always loved to sew and would often sew garments for her daughter. This creative artist discovered quilting by joining Needles and Threads Quilters Guild at Fernwood Center, and the rest is history. Jean is now Jean is past president of the guild and says the whole experience has been among many wonderful things. It has been an exciting and an excellent exercise for the brain. I present to you our moderator for this afternoon, Miss Jean Chaney.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm delighted to introduce our very esteemed president, Susan Trice, who has very carefully and quietly led us virtually during this pandemic. Susan is serving her second period as our president. And this year marks her 20th membership year as a Needles and Threads member. So it is my pleasure to introduce our president, Susan Trice, who will give us some information about herself as a quilter, as well as give us some information about our guild.
Thank you so much, Jean. Thank you for that introduction. And I also thank you for telling me how long I've been in the guild because, sometimes you count back and you lose some years. And so I knew it was around that amount of time, but thank you so much for that. And I'm so excited about this opportunity for Needles and Thread to showcase ourselves, to share a little bit about quilting today. I want to thank Diaspora Rhythms and Art Smart for giving us this opportunity to collaborate on Juneteenth, our very first official Juneteenth observance. A little bit about Needles and Thread is that we will be celebrating our 30th year anniversary next year in 2022. Our first guild meeting was February 22nd of 1992. We currently have about 105 members at this point. Our mission is to promote the love of quilting, to grow the art of quilting through teaching and sharing, to assemble our quilters for the purpose of sharing and ideas and skills, and to learn new technique, uh, to learn new techniques through demonstrations and instruction. We also like to support our community through any kind of service opportunities that arise. Needles and Thread has a biannual quilt show, which our next quilt show is slated for fall of 2022. And we also have a self published book called Culture and Traditions, an African American quilt experience. A little history about quilting. Many of us may have grown up in our families with mother, grandmother, great grandmother quilting, aunties quilting. So it is in our life experience. And then some of us may have learned how to quilt from them. The history of quilting in our community, in our culture, is that we made quilts for necessity, which we call utility quilts. But inside of these quilts, these Black women found a way to express themselves through the fabrics that they may have had available to them, and just designing that quilt top and using the stitches of that needle and thread to just put that final layer on that quilt and express themselves. The artistry of quilting was very apparent in these quilts that they made, even though they were just for utilitarian purposes. The anatomy of a quilt, just to be brief, is the quilt top, the middle, which is we call the batting, the backing, and then the binding to finish it off around the edges. Then there's the stitching that it takes place, which is taking all those three layers and with the needle and thread, sewing them together and bringing that out with the thread choice, as well as the stitching design that one is going to use to put that together. The magic and artistry of a quilt is the spirit of that quilt and is revealed with the intention of the quilt maker, the story that she or he is trying to convey, the fabric choices, the color, the texture, the pattern design that they're going to use to create that top, as well as the back. Many times, historically, the back was used to just be a plain piece of white fabric on the back, but nowadays we have the opportunity to not only design the front, but the back as well. And through these choices, as well as with the thread choice and the stitching designs, creates the magic of a quilt. The quilt maker will also name his or her quilt, which indicates that there's a story inside that quilt. And all you need to do is ask, and it will be told. Quilts can come in traditional style, a contemporary style, a portrait quilt, or a story quilt. And then the one last thing I will say is that our as quilters, we also will use some of these techniques to then make other things such as home decor, dolls, wearable art. So it shows up in so many other ways. So for me, like Gina said, I've been with the Guild for 20 years, never knew how to sew, but was always just so intrigued with quilts and understanding that there's significant time, artistry into making a quilt and materials. I could never afford a quilt. And so I figured, not a handmade quilt. So I figured I better learn how to quilt. And so that's what I did. So with that, I want to hand this over to Jean again. Thank you so much for having us, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. That was certainly enlightening. And now I'd like to individually introduce each of our exhibitors today. And the first exhibitor that we have is Margot Haynes. And Margot was fascinated by a black and gold treadle singer machine. I'm sure all of us, or many of us, remember those machines. And she just started quilting since retirement. So, Margot, tell us something about your quilt journey.
Thank you, Jean. I'd also like to thank Art Smart and Diaspora Rhythms Committee for inviting us, and I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. When I was young, as Jean said, my mom had a Singer pedestal sewing machine, and I was fascinated because of the way the pedestal went back and forth and made the machine move, and so my mom taught me how to sew on it. I didn't get very good because I didn't spend a lot of time with it, but I did make some clothing items in my teenage years. What really fascinated me was an old quilt that my mom had that she took very good care of. And I don't know if it was my grandmother or my great grandmother that made it, but it was pieces of clothing in different colorful fabrics. And I think that's why most of my quilts I like are very, very colorful. Um, I sensed that the quilt that she had was special, but I didn't get to understand or appreciate it until I became an adult. And by that time, the quilt was gone. Um, the quilt that I'm presenting today, we go on shop hops, and a shop hop is a bus trip to um, buy fabric. And you never have enough fabric, and you never have too much fabric. So we just love to go on shop hops and buy fabric. So in one particular store, they had the quilt hanging on the wall, and I went over to look at it closer, and they were asking for participants for a block of the month project that they had coming up. But the owner told me that they were all filled up. So I went and talked to the salesperson by the quilt, got the name of the quilt, and I went and looked it up when I got back home. It's a piece by an Australian designer whose name is Wendy Williams, and she titles this The Urban Owls. So I ordered it from Australia along with a couple of pieces of fabric that for the centerpiece. Uh, I was really excited when the pattern came. I took it to the Quilt Guild, showed it to my friends. They all laughed and teased me because it was a 40-page booklet. And they were like, okay, yeah, right, let's see you do this. So it was kind of also a challenge to me. I'm not exactly sure when I began working on it. I think it was the early fall of 2019. But I looked through the pattern and started planning what I was going to do. I had never done hand embroidery. And let me go back. There are four techniques that this quilt has. It has machine piecing, machine applique, hand applique, and foundation piecing. Machine piecing is just sewing blocks together with your machine. The machine applique is sewing the fabric designs onto fabric by machine. And hand applique is sewing fabric designs by hand onto the blocks. And the foundation piecing is fabric that's stitched directly on the paper and is trimmed to a specific shape that's going to be used to create the block with complex designs. It has very sharp points and perfectly matched intersections.
I had never done hand embroidery, so I bugged a couple of the ladies at the Quilting Guild to help me out. And then one of the ladies, Cynthia Bernardo, gave a class which I took on hand embroidery. The quilt has 10 block designs, including the center panel. Some blocks were multiple. For example, there are 32 pinwheels that go around the outer edge. There are 40 flying geese that are on the inner, um, around the center panel. I used over 80 fabrics. Some of them I used more than once. It took me over a year to complete the piecing. It's not finished. It has been quilted. The piece that you're looking at is just the top. But as of today, it has been quilted. Doris Barnes quilted it. And I wish that you could see the beautiful designs that she put on it. And if you come to our show next year, scheduled, you will see it because I plan to have it up then. I still have to bind it. And to make it specially my piece, I'm going to kind of bling the flowers. Um, the finished size is 66 by 80. So I hope you enjoy it, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Beautiful. Mm,
Gorgeous, gorgeous,
mm, mm,
gorgeous.
mm, mm, mm.
That is just fantastic. Yes.
Thank you.
Hmm. Okay, next we've got Anita Scott. And Anita saw her first quilt on a cruise ship, and the quilt was being raffled. Unfortunately, she didn't win the raffle, but it piqued her interest in learning how to quilt. So tell us more, Anita, about your quilt journey.
Hi, everyone. Happy Juneteenth. As Jean said, I did not win that quilt, and it was a beautiful quilt. My journey started on that cruise. When I saw the quilt, I knew nothing about quilts at all. I was interested in sewing in high school, and my plan was when I retired get to start sewing back again. Unfortunately, I was hooked on the quilt. I joined Needles and Thread in 2009, and I've been going ever since. I love quilting. It's very relaxing, and the quilts that we make are just awesome. I have seen so many lovely quilts. Um, Joining Needles and Thread really seemed to open up my eyes because uh, my family, as far as I know, did not do any type of sewing. So I don't know where I got the knack from, but I truly enjoy it. 2009 is when I retired. I joined Needles and Thread, and I was amazed that this guild was so open and so warm. And I've just enjoyed it. The quilts that I have made, some I have given away to family members or friends, but the majority of them I still have. I put some in the show, and if it's available to be sold, I will sell them. My first quilt was called a chair rail. It was done in blues because I love blue, and I still have that quilt today. It was like a little throw. Um, After that, it seemed like there was so many designs and so many patterns that I just didn't know which way to go. But I said I'm gonna give it a shot. Um, I made a wall hanging, which is I call it the lady, her baby, and there seemed to be traveling somewhere, nowhere in particular, but it took me a while to really do this. This is what they call applique. And I was a little skeptical because I had never done applique. But I decided to go ahead and tackle it. And this just made me smile. Every time I see it, the face came out perfect. The baby came out perfect. And that what really had me on edge because I was not that fluent in applique. The water picture really gave me pause because I didn't want it to look like it was tilted. I wanted to look like it was at ease on top of her head as she was carrying her baby and walking to wherever it was that she was going at the time. I think it turned out pretty good and I'm really pleased with it. Also, the quilting experience with everything that has been going on in the world today is very relaxing to me. So I enjoy it. Anybody that say they cannot quilt, you can. It just takes time. The second one, this one is called Convex Illusions. This was given by a class at Needles and Thread by program director Neva Rodez at the time. And the center is illuminated and everything else around it, it just seems to frame it. This was the first time that I used pieces so small that sewed together. It was like, how am I going to do this? How is this going to turn out like the pattern, the picture on the pattern? But I think it turned out pretty good and I love it. I'm also considering maybe doing it again, but it was a challenge to me because all those pieces, all those little pieces, is something that I'm not really used to doing, but I'm glad I did it. And that's basically how I got into quilting, and I will never give it up, even though sometimes I do some sewing for clothing, but not much.
Thanks so much, Anita. You know what? I was hesitant about that illusions quilt, not because of those little pieces, but I felt that "Oh, I don't think I'm going to do this. But you know what? Maybe I might consider it. So I hope you still have the pattern. All right, our next exhibitor is LaSharon Bankhead, and Susan was talking about the influence of grandmothers on quilters, and what's really interesting about LaSharon is that she designed a quilt for her family, and they all worked on it together. So, LaSharon, we're certainly anxious to hear about how that worked out. So, you want to tell us about it and tell us about the kinds of things that you like doing as quilting as well as some other things, okay?
Okay. Well, this is La Sharon Bankhead. I know the name says La Cheryl, but it's La Sharon Bankhead. And what Jean was speaking about was a quilt that I did with my family. It didn't include my younger daughter, but one thing that came about from my son and my oldest daughter is that when they look at the quilt, they can see all the pieces that they did. Most of the things I cut out and designed it. It was depicting a family reunion, which we have every year. And it tells the story of that, where we just get together, socialize, talk, eat, eat, and drink. And I say eat twice or three times. Anyway, and that That quote has been framed, and it's I'm saying it's about 80 by 60, and it does hang in my family room to this day. And the other quotes that I like to talk about are the ones that were inspired by several people in my family. Here is you can learn how to do this. This is walking our yo-yo dog. These are two dolls, and they were made from yo-yos, purely yo-yos, circular disc or of material. And what it is, I did do a something to make it easier. I designed a pattern for this for people to purchase if they wanted to, and they did. And many of these dolls today were shown in the quilt show years and years ago. But I wanted to make mine even more special and different, so I made a boy and a girl walking with the dog. And this is a design that I created, and you could create it however you like. But I created the dog, and I really like doing this type of thing. And I do make small dolls as well as larger dolls than this one. And as you can see, the faces are embroidered, and oftentimes they are hand painted by me. The faces are. So if we can move to the next slide. This is a quilt that I really was inspired by. Most of my quilts I do design on my own. I do not buy patterns. And this is a pattern. I was brought up in Chicago mainly, but I am from the South. My family is. And if you look at this quilt, to me, it depicts all the colors that you can see about Chicago and the lakefront. And this is where I grew up at. I grew up near the lake, and we used to walk to the lake and we eat and we have a barbecue or something like that. If you look at the picture closer, you will see a barbecue. And it was small boats along the Chicago River, along the Lake Michigan side. And in the background, you always saw colorful people. And so I decided to make my colorful people be the skyline that I saw behind them, which is you can see that each of the buildings are in their own kente cloth print, but you can clearly see that is clearly the Chicago skyline. Also one of the things that I did for this one is I put a border around it in the kente cloth print, which brought out everything for me. And as again, I do not buy designs. I do design my own quilts. And this actually has a texture quilt. I like doing 3D. And if you look at the rocks, when we used to play along the rocks, they were rocky, and sometimes your foot would go into the concrete and you come back out with it scuffed up. So that's one of the things that I wanted to point out is that this was a fun quote for me to do, depicting where I grew up and my family. Even though you don't see pictures of people, you see the buildings that depict Chicago, which to me transcends to some of the people wearing their kente cloth print, especially on special holidays. So we can go to the next slide. The next slide, this is a doll that I love creating dolls, and I design my own dolls. And what happened is this, in the News of Thread, one of our class sessions, someone came to me with a broken doll, and they said, how can you fix it? So I fixed it, and they wanted to know, what did I use? How did I do it? And why did I do it? And next thing I know, it turned into a class. And that was one of the most people have attended that class to this day, and I think it still probably breaks a record. But anyway, this doll is made purely out of a plastic recyclable bottle. And that's why it's called Raspberry Lemonade. Raspberry is from her hat that I made. Everything on here was made. You don't have to know how to quilt or anything. You could just create what you like and put your own special spin on it. And that's why I call it the twist of denim. And so people in the class got to make their own dolls. And some of them, I created a quilt for each, I created a kit for each one of the people to start off with, so they didn't have to take the entire time just creating the base of the doll, which I did for them. And what they did was they created the doll with their pieces of fabric that they liked. And also we designed the faces in embroidery. And so I embroidered all the faces. And as you can see, she has earrings, denim things on her. But this was one of the dolls that gives me most fun, or most I like to talk about. So this is Raspberry Lemonade with the twist of denim. And all my dolls Most of them are for sale. Some of them are not. This happens to be one that is not. I really like the color scheme, but you can also can get this doll as well, similar to what is done there. I never, as an artist, you never do two things alike, and that's what I like to do. I never do two things alike. So to the next slide. This quilt, it's a mini quilt, and it was inspired by a person who gave us shout outs in the book, Juanita Yeager. I was inspired by her. She's a renowned court artist, and I was inspired by that. One of the things is this is my favorite flower. If people are familiar with flowers, they will know that this is a hibiscus. And from the South, my grandmother always had hibiscus. And I will always wanted to know how come we don't have them in the North. And later I found out she gave us one. And she said, it'll grow back. And so I took that one home and planted it. And yes, it did go grow back, but it wasn't full of the blooms that was in my grandmother's yard. So I decided to plant them in my own yard. And this happened to be one of the biggest ones I ever had. So I designed it. I took I usually try to take my quotes and paint them first. And then I design a quote based upon my paintings. Just like the quote, my Kente Site, it was actually a painting first that I designed into a quote. This happened to be the hibiscus pink flower that I designed, that I didn't design it, but it was its own design. But I painted it and I actually did the quilting for this piece as well. So I wanted to highlight this one because it's one of the favorite flowers that I grew up since I was a little girl until now, which is much older. So anyway, this is called hibiscus, my favorite flower. It was inspired by Juanita Yeager.
Thank you so much for sharing your awesome creativity with us. Not just quilts, dolls,
Mhm.
wall hangings, and so forth. Well, 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 who's this? LaCheryl. LaCheryl Smith. I guess you noticed that there's a resemblance between LaSharon and LaCheryl. Now, LaCheryl likes to incorporate embroidery whenever she can, based on seeing her mother do a lot of cross stitching. So, do you have any of this cross stitching to show us today?
I have some embroidery that's in there.
Okay.
In there. I mean, you could start with the pictures, but my love of sewing started when my grandmother she gave me a quote. And so this actual view graph here shows all the quote, a quilted coat as well as a tote and a cap. It started from a class from Sheila Bell, who was a book guild member. She had wanted us to do the jelly roll race. So I could sew already. I knew how to do things. So I just said, you know what, I don't like this as a quilt. So I turned it into a coat and turned it into a hat and a tote. So that's what this one represents. And it has embroidery in there. I don't know if you can see it, but if you look at the top of the coat where it opens, there are elephants embroidered all through the lining. This is quilted with embroidery. And but that's the basis of this. That's because, like I said, this came from the Jelly Roll. That's actually a quilt that was quilted on my embroidery machine. And this one is actually this is my Chicago. This is as you can see, the projects in the background there. Was raised in the projects. My mother and father, they had their dream of us move. They moved us up here from down south, and then we moved into the projects. And their dream was always to move into a house. And this is what this shows. My sister was actually the one who painted this as a picture, and I turned it into a quilt. And it's called My Chicago. And that red bug that you see there is the one that we use, that we bought ourselves after we finished high school and started working. But that's what this quote shows. And this is actually a class that was taught by our program director at that time was Cynthia Bernardo. She taught a class about how to use this ruler. It was a different ruler. And anyway, I wind up doing a table runner from it, and made the edges jagged on it. And this is one of those. It's a table runner and it's still used today. And I've got many requests to do table runners for people after they see this one. And so I like doing crafty things. And it's a challenge. The next slide. Okay, this quilt is actually from a class that was taught again by Sheila Bell. She's a quilt girl. She's one of the NTQG members. She had it as a two-piece. It was a two-piece quilt. It's supposed to be just two colors. Anyway, again, it's sewing two colors together. Anyway, that was boring to me. So what I wind up doing was putting a border on it and also putting applique on it. So that face in the middle is the things that I added. Also the white and the black that you see, I added as well. And after that, I really, really like the quilt. So this is one of those things. Yeah, red, black, mass two color quilt. Okay. Anyway, the next slide. Oh boy, this one right here is this was a challenge for me. I'm going to tell you it was a challenge. And this was taught by, well, actually wasn't taught, it was inspired by Jean Cobbs, an NTQG member. Anyway, this was from the Hoop Sisters. It's all done on my embroidery machine, one block at a time. And this was, I got hooked on this quilt. I got hooked on it and stayed on it until I finished it. But I'm going to tell you, it's one of those challenges you just say, I don't know if I do this again. But actually, I will. But this came, the entire thing from the piecing to the quilting to everything is done on an embroidery machine. The only thing that's not is the outer border. That's actually done on with my sewing machine. And this actually incorporates everything that I like to do: sewing, embroidery, and quilting. And like I said, my sewing, love from sewing, I figured it came from my grandmother because she would give her grandkids, she gave me a quilt as a little girl. And I never saw her sew, but she gave me that quilt. And we talk about batting today. Years ago, it wasn't batting in the quilt. It was actually more fabric because my quilt is heavy, extremely heavy. And so I think that's where I picked up the desire to sew, because I've been sewing since I was a little girl. I taught myself how to sew, and I taught myself how to do the embroidery and things of that nature. And I was introduced to Needles and Thread Quilters Guild from a co-worker of mine when I started working at AT&T, and that was Betty Waters, who was a former guild member. She knew some, well, when I started working, I only was around white men, and she was one of the few Black managers that said, she took me under her wing and she says, I think you need to be introduced to something else. So she and I already had she knew how to sew, I knew how to sew, and she said, I think you would like Needles and Threads Quilters Guild. And ever since then, she was right, and that just really helped because it's yeah.
That was really an interesting story. And your work is just beautiful.
Thank you.
You and your sister are so talented. All right, the next person is Dorothy Burge. You know, I didn't know Dorothy is really very modest, and I really didn't know about her accomplishments until I saw her conducting. I guess she and Carolyn Maslumi, who was a very famous quilter, had this interview on, I think it was on YouTube, and her discussion about activism and representing how she feels about some of the acts against Black people really did catch my attention. And so I'd like for her to share some of her work with you, not only as a quilter, but as an activist. So, Dorothy, you're on.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you all inviting me to speak. I've been a member of Needles and Thread Quilting Guild for years, and it has been a wonderful experience for me. The first quilt that I want to talk about is a quilt of James Cameron. And this quilt was created in 2007 for an exhibit that was going to be at the DuSable Museum called Citizens Picnic. So they reached out to me and they said, can you create a quilt about the lynchings that have occurred in this country? And so when my daughter was in high school, we went to the Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee and we actually met James Cameron. And James Cameron was an incredible human being who in 1930, at the age of 16, survived a lynching in Marion, Indiana. And I was so moved by him and so moved by his story that I came back and created this quilt. And if you look closely, the tags have information about him. It talks about the fact that, you know, he survived the lynching, he came back, started several chapters of the NAACP, and then also created the Black Holocaust Museum in Wisconsin. And this quilt was part of the exhibit Citizens Lynching at the DuSable Museum. So it's really an honor to talk about this during Juneteenth, because what I try to do is quilt from the perspective of an African American woman and mother, and I try to tell the story of our history from that perspective so that when my children and grandchildren have the quilts, they will have something to, instead of oral history, it'll be quilted history in the same way that history was passed down to me orally. The next quilt is a quilt of Troy Davis, and Troy Davis was convicted of a murder in 1989 of a police officer in Georgia, and he received the death penalty. He always maintained that he was innocent, and so in 2011, when they planned his execution, there were protests all over the country. 9 people testified against him, saying that they had seen him commit the murder. Of those 9, 7 people recanted and said that what they said had not been true. And at the time when the execution was scheduled, there was mass protests. I was at a protest at the Daly Center, and we got the news that Troy Davis had been given a stay of execution, and we left. And by the time we got home, we discovered that he had been executed. They only told us that there was a stay to stop the protest. And so in this quilt, you will see several figures. One is Anubis, and Anubis is an Egyptian figure who is the person who takes the spirit of someone who has passed to the gods so that they can determine if that person is deserving of an afterlife. Also in this quilt is the Ankh, which is the symbol of everlasting life, and then the Eye of Haru, which means that God knows the truth. And so this was the way that I wanted to honor Troy Davis and Troy Davis's life. The next quilt is a quilt of Laquan McDonald, and Laquan McDonald was a young man who was killed in Chicago by Chicago police, and the tape was he was 17 years old, and this killing happened in 2014. And so someone called the police and said that this young man was acting very erratically, and he was on the south side. Several police officers came. They did not have a taser, so they called for a police officer to come with a taser so that they could subdue him. Within 2 minutes of the officer that they called arriving on the scene, he got out of his car, shot Laquan McDonald 16 times, and reloaded his gun and was about to shoot more bullets into him, but was stopped by another police officer. What I did when I heard about this case is I pulled the autopsy report, and I used a photo of my great great nephew to symbolize Laquan McDonald. Once again, quilting from the perspective of an African woman and mother. And I put the bullet holes, the 16 bullet holes, in all the places where Laquan had been shot. And I did this to raise awareness about what had happened to Laquan and hoping that people would be spurred into action to actually do something about the killing of African American youth by police in Chicago. These are quilts that I did last year after George Floyd was killed. My great great niece and great great nephew were protesting outside of their home, and they were sitting on signs that said, "I can't breathe." We took photos of them and turned them into quilts as a way to honor George Floyd, but also a way to have the history of what is happening to us as African Americans in this country not be lost. So my goal is to educate and to push people to action and also to record history. This is one of the first protest quilts that I did. I was protesting the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012, and I did not have a banner. And I went out and I stopped at Walgreens and got Skittles and iced tea because Trayvon had been carrying that when he was killed. He got killed because the neighborhood watch person said he looked suspicious because he had on a hoodie. So Hoodies Up Day happened at our church. It was something that was proposed by one of the NBA players. And so Hoodies Up Day is something that LeBron James asked people to do. We all came to church, we had hoodies. And so I asked, after seeing my great nephew, if someone would go to the local store, get some Skittles and iced tea. We gave it to him. He held it for about 30 seconds so that we could take the photo, and then he started tossing it everywhere. And then I turned that photo into a protest banner, and I used that banner to protest with when I would go out to seek justice for Trayvon Martin. Later on, if you can see, the quilt on the right is actually signed by his mother and father. And it is something that this is called Trayvon Could Be My Son, because I really do feel like when we see what's happening to youth in this country, that is some of the emotion that we have as African American women. Thank you.
I'm sure all of us are moved by your quilts and some hidden history. I had never heard of James Cameron or Troy. So thank you so much for enlightening us.
Thank you.
Our next exhibitor is also going to provide us with a demonstration. And I want her to complete this sentence. Not a day goes by. All right, Doris.
Not a day goes by that I'm not in my studio sewing. Okay, my name is Doris Barnes. I'm a quilter. I love to quilt. I quilt every day. And this first, I can tell you a little something about me. I'm from Mississippi. I learned how to quilt from my godmother in Vicksburg, Mississippi. And at that time, we also had home ec, so I took home ec. Of course, I got in a lot of trouble because I already knew how to sew, so the teacher couldn't tell me anything. At least I thought she couldn't. Okay, so this first quilt is from a class taught by one of the Needles and Thread members, and it's called a shadow quilt. And if you notice, you look at the quilt, you can see the ladies look like there's a shadow behind them, and that the blocks are really look like they're floating. So I searched my various fabrics that I had, and I had these ladies that just had been cut apart from another quilt. So I just pulled out my yellow and black fabric, which are a lot of the colors in the quilt, and this is what I came up with. So it's just a shadow quilt of some African ladies. Now we can go to the next one. I also like LaCheryl. I love to embroider, and I do a lot of digitizing. So I take pictures of things and I actually digitize and create my own stitch out. So this was one that was created because I went to see Black Panther and I fell in love with the movie. So I made this quilt, which all of these items, the people in here are actually nothing but stitches. And I do that on an automatic embroidery machine. And then I take it and put it together and quilt it. So the cross hatching in the back are stitches that are done on my long arm machine, which you will see some examples of that later. Next one. This one is called, one second. And of course, I also make labels for all my quilts on the embroidery machine. So I label them, I put names, all the pertinent information. Now, this quilt I found online. It's a paper piecing quilt of the ladies in the center, and it's called Sisterhood. And it was created, and they sold the pattern to actually make money for a nonprofit organization in Canada to help take care of ladies. So I thought this was something beautiful, and of course, I had to do the background in my favorite color, which is purple, which is also something I do every day. I quilt and I sew in purple every day. Now you can show the video. Hi, this is how you quilt a quilt. You have the piece top, the batting, and the backing all loaded on this long arm machine. And then you put the 3 layers together, and then you can take the machine and we can start quilting. So I will quilt. First I tack down the quilt. So I just run the quilt along. To do that. And right now I am just tacking the quilt down so that it would make it easier for me to do all the quilting. Of course, the machine don't want to work right. And now that I've tacked the quilt top down, I've basted the quilt top down. Of course, I have to cut all these threads so it doesn't interfere with anything. And with this machine, I can do the quilting free motion, which is what I'm doing now, and I can also do computerized. But for now, I'm just going to show you how we do it free motion. And this is how I put all the stitches on the quilt. And that's how a quilt is.
That's great. What were the women of the inauguration?
Uh, the women of the inauguration was the Vice President and Michelle Obama,
Oh, okay.
which I have hanging behind me now. It's finished. So It was just something I was playing around with. I saw some graphics online and I just digitized pictures of them and created a small wall hanging.
Wonderful. Well, Doris is our in-house long arm quilter, and I think just about everybody has had Doris do some quilting for them. In fact, Doris, what happened? You were supposed to come and get my quilt. All right.
I forgot. I will do it.
All right. Those are all of our panelists and our wonderful creative quilters that have shared with you their work today. And so let's see if we have any questions on the chat.
Jean,
Annabelle?
at this time, Jean, we do not have any questions. We have a lot of great compliments, though. A lot of great compliments. So,
Well, I have some questions that maybe I can ask, and anybody on the panel can answer them. Um, First question is, what step in the quilting process is most pleasant for you, and which one don't you like? So does anybody want to answer that one?
Answer one, Jean, by Sharon. The most pleasurable step that I have is always the designing of the quilt because I get to do a painting because I like painting because of my grandmother used to paint all of her furniture outside. Another thing that I don't like is the binding of a quilt because it's done by hand. It's not painted at all. It's just fabric. And so I do like putting the fabric there, but I don't like the put actually taking the stitches and binding by hand.
Okay, does anybody else have any kind of response to that question? No?
Well,
okay.
Jean, this is Doris. I like all the steps. I like from start to finish. And I really have lately begun to really love binding. I don't do a lot of binding anymore on my hand. I do it all by machine.
So are you going to give a class on that?
No.
Why not?
Jean, we did have one question, one or two questions come in. If you
Oh,
don't mind, can I ask? One question that came in is, what is the best way to care for quilts? I have five that are about 70 years old. Anyone want to answer that?
Only thing I can, this is what she, the only thing I can say is take special care of them be, because some of them may have to be refurbished if you see something tearing or that shows wear. But that's about it that I would suggest is special care because the ones I can think of the ones for myself that I got from my grandmother's and hers I know are probably at least 55 years old, the ones that I have from her. And I have taken great care of those. I have washed them and just took special care with them.
Okay, thank you.
I think one of the things that's said is that you shouldn't store them in plastic. That's one thing. And if you can, frequently take them out, refold them so that they don't get permanent creases. And then sometimes you can fold them inside, get some paper, some kind of paper and ball it up and kind of to help relax those folds when you're folding them up. But fold it up maybe in a pillowcase, put it in a pillowcase, store it that way so it can get some air, but not in plastic and not, near sunlight or heat, that kind of thing that will help.
Another thing that I found out is I had this cedar chest that my mother-in-law had, and I had plans on putting my quilts in there. And the appraiser said that is the worst place for your quilt is a cedar chest. So I was really surprised by that. And just like Susan said, the a pillowcase and folding and refolding occasionally, sometimes people roll their quilts too.
Rolling them too, yeah. Hmm.
Another thing I found out is on Antiques Roadshow that washing a quilt decreases its value.
Yeah,
Thank
but
you.
the thing about it, you have to figure out are there quotes that are to be used every day? And if it's a quote that you really want to keep, if it's a piece to be like a keepsake, it probably could be hung up as a wall hanging, and
Hmm.
that'll help preserve it as well. Because some of my quotes, like the one I have behind me, is one ties to my father. Those are all the ties that my father would wear, and I wanted to turn them into a quilt so I could have something as a remembrance of him, and also my kids could have as well. But the quilts that came from my grandmother were utilitarian quilts. They were to keep me warm, and so therefore they got used.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
but anyway,
Thank you all. Those are some great responses. Gene, I have two more questions before we close out. One question was, what type of paints do you use?
oh, this is what Sharon. Some of the paints that I use, I actually use real paints like acrylic type of painting, or sometimes I use watercolor painting, even crayon type of painting on your quilts. You just have to just look at the fabric and use the appropriate paint. Like if it's a rough one, you could actually, if it's a rough one, you want to make dimension, you could actually use the crayon paint. And they have marker paints as well. I've taught classes on the marker paints as well as the crayon paints, and nobody wants to go into the acrylic side of it. So we haven't went there yet, but that's what I would use on the different fabrics. Or you can actually use fabric paint. I use all four of them.
And you can also actually use color pencils too. And then there's a medium you
Hmm.
can use on top of the color pencils to make it permanent on your fabric.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have one more question, and it's based off a piece that I had that we showed early in the slide. The question states that during the intro, there was a quilt with a little girl with two butterfly hair ties. She has on a shirt with a red rose. I'm going to show the picture in a second. What technique was used to create the image, and what is the applique or embroidered?
Applique.
Applique, thank you, or embroidered. I mean, was that applique or embroidered?
No,
And I'm about to show it so you all can address the question. Here we go. Is anyone able to answer this one?
I'm. This is done by someone who's not on the call. I believe
Yes.
that is quilted. It is applique technique is applique.
Right. It is applique.
Right. It's embroidered. I'm not embroidered. It's actually quilted on a quilting. It could be quilted with a sewing machine or a long arm. And this one looked to me, if I had to guess, I would say it's actually done with a sewing machine.
Yeah, that's what it looks like.
Are you passing on the legacy of quilting to others? Any of you?
Yes. I can state that I go to Oakdale Covenant Church, and every summer we have classes for the kids, and we teach the little kids how to do various sewing techniques. And I also teach private classes at my house.
I do a lot of work in the community, and so I am part of the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial Project for the survivors of John Burge, and we have the survivors speak, and then we teach community members how to do patches with words that honor the survivors of the police torture.
Okay.
I have can you hear me? Okay. Actually during the pandemic, I taught my neighbor how to quilt, and so she's got both feet in now, and there's no turning back from her for her. And then also, I just wanted to say that although I didn't have sewing in my family or quilting in my family, since I have joined Needles and Thread, my mother joined Needles and Thread and learned how to quilt. So we both quilt, but her quilting started after my quilting started.
My grandson has shown an interest in elaborating on clothing, sweatshirts and sweatpants, and so he's done a little bit of embroidery um, and a little bit of enhancing his clothing. And also, I work with Doris during the summer with the camp, teaching the children how to sew.
Well, that's wonderful because I remember the guild went to a school, and one of the questions we asked the children is, "Do you know what quilting is?" And this little boy said, "It's something grandmas do." So I am so happy that we are going younger than grandmas to teach this wonderful hobby because it is rewarding, it's therapeutic, it's creative, and I love it too.
Yeah. And I also consider it to be spiritual. It is a time when you're sitting, you're thinking, you're contemplating, you're allowing yourself, your mind to be free and express yourself. And I think those quilts hold all of that inside of those fabrics and those stitches. And so I just think it really is, you know, a spiritual experience as well.
Yeah. And also to piggyback on what Jean had mentioned is that our guild has gone to several schools, several outlets, such as the one for the University of Chicago, teaching the children there how to. At that time, we did not teach them to sew with the sewing machine, but we did teach them how to sew with their hand and do some many things. In every class that we do teach within the community, they have a takeaway project such as the ones that Gene Cobbs has done with the kids doing the pillowcase, using pillowcase projects, and also with Doris's volunteering for that and other members of our guild. But we get involved with the community. If we have someone to come and ask us to tell them about quilting or teach them about quilting in terms of children, we are there. Mm-hmm. And I saw someone ask about when is our Quilt Guild show. It's going to be in October of 2022. Is usually the third Saturday and Sunday of the month of October.
And Jane, before we officially close out, I did have one more question. There's quite a few of us on here, and we were asked how can individuals get in contact if they want to purchase something. I have put out there the website, but Susan, what would you suggest? Because there's quite a few of us on here.
Yeah, I would suggest going to the website. Actually, Doris is our webmaster, and anything that's any inquiries that come through our website, she is on top of. And so I think that would probably be the best way.
I just want to thank you, ladies. First of all, I'm getting all kind of messages about Gene Chaney. You have done a fabulous. I'm repeating what's going on the screen in the chat. They said you did a fabulous job, magnificent.
Yes, Gene. Thank you.
Let's give Gene a hand, please.
Yes,
yes,
absolutely,
yes.
Gene.
Wonderful.
Thank you so much.
You did an excellent job, Gene.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
You ladies, each of you.
Excellent job.
I don't know, we can't thank you enough. You just filled us, you gave us history, you gave us inspiration, you educated us. Thank you so much. I can think of no other uh, event we could have had that could best commemorate our Juneteenth Day better than this. So thank you so much. And to our committee who put all of this together, I just have to, first of all, thank uh, Manville Robinson and Sherry Harris. They are our co-chairpersons. There is Freddie Smith, Eleanor Hambrick, and of course, Jean Cheney,
Yes.
Gina Carter, Donna Feaster, and yours truly, Dan Parker. We are all on the committee. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Uh, and if you're interested in